What do you make of the GDP numbers so far?
I think the best way we can describe it is the calm before a much bigger storm. And it's hard to imagine how it could get much worse because the bushfires were terrible, had an atrocious impact on people's lives and the economy. But this 0.3% contraction, it actually only 10% of that reflects the shutdowns because it's up into the March quarter. The shutdown started about mid-March. So I would say it's an indication of what's to come. And I think the way we know what is to come is if we look at what's happening to employment figures, because the ABS puts out the employment statistics before the GDP stats. And the latest stats in that department show millions of jobs thrown on the scrap heap. So I think the way I would summarize today's announcement is it's indicative of the economy we had coming into the pandemic, which was not that fancy, had a lot of problems, but it's also actually not speaking to the real economic and social pain that's being felt across the economy in Australian people's lives right now.
Yeah, and as you said, more than 1 million people thrown out of work, and the Bureau of Statistics for the April figures saying something like 2.7 million people either unemployed or reduced hours because of the coronavirus crisis. So RBA predicting a 10% unemployment rate over the June quarter. Is that too optimistic?
Well, I think it is optimistic because I think we already know it's far worse. So formal unemployment stats are 6.2, 6.3%. Formal unemployment is about 830,000 people. But if we add on to that figure the number of people who are employed but haven't worked a single hour, so some of these people are captured by the JobKeeper payment, but some of them have just been stood down, and that's about another 500,000 people. 750,000 people. And then you add on the people who have dropped out of the labour market, so they've given up on the world of work, so to speak. That's 550,000 people. And then if you actually take the contraction in all of the hours that's being worked, so add up all of the people who've had to dock their hours, and you add them up, and in full-time equivalent jobs, that's actually another 550,000 jobs. So right now, we think that there is about 2.3 million people equivalent out of work, which is 20% of the labour market. So it's already worse. I think if the RBA are pointing to a 10% formal unemployment rate, then I think we have to start thinking about how are our definitions of unemployment actually helping us to understand the full scale of the problem right now.
Do you think that this crisis has changed Australia's employment landscape forever? Will some people just be left on the jobless queues forever and not be able to get another permanent job?
Well, I think about the economy we had coming into the crisis, and in the previous package it was sort of discussed some of the aspects of this. We had a low productivity environment, very high underutilization, so high underemployment, high unemployment, and the types of jobs that were being worked were increasingly service insecure roles, low productivity roles. As firms got smaller and smaller over time, people started to work for these micro businesses. And so it's because those very small firms are so demand responsive, when we have a collapse in demand like we do now, it's fair to say a lot of these jobs that have been lost in some of these services sectors it's gonna be hard to get those jobs back. And that's why it's so important that we start to shift the discussion about what kind of jobs do we need for the future? And I think the climate change issue is a really serious one that brings to point how prepared we are for how fitted out our economy is for the challenges we face, and what kind of productive capacity do we have at the moment. And this is where it's so important we have a discussion about the role of expanding public employment and the role of government in actually directly creating jobs. And this is what we did in the Depression, and in our 1940s reconstruction, and it's exactly the type of thinking that we need to be pushing towards now.
So if some industries are on the way out and seriously challenged in the future, do you think we're doing enough to create new industries, considering that coronavirus could be with us permanently, and also we're facing climate change?
Yeah, and I mean, look at accommodation and food services, where we've had an explosion in this employment in this industry in the last sort of 10, 15 years. And really, social distancing and, that sort of physical distancing is going to be part of disease containment now for years to come. So even if we look at some of those high employing sectors and we have to ask, well, if these aren't going to be immediately bouncing back, then what kind of sectors are we producing and getting ready for? And I think Australia is very far behind the 8 ball in this regard. And it's primarily because we've had decades of essentially market worshipping policies that believe that we have to sit back and sit on our hands and wait for independent or private interests to create these industries. And it just simply hasn't happened. And so there is a big discussion happening now about the failure of Australia to prepare its own industry policy so that we had something to fall back on in this time. And this is where the discussion about putting manufacturing back into Australia and rebuilding that productive base is so important. And it's in part been created because we import 95% of our medical goods, which is a really vulnerable position for our nation to be in the middle of a pandemic.
Alison Pennington from the Centre for Future Work. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.